Rental cars. Most people have used them at some point, and most are used to places like Hertz, Avis, or Enterprise. These places make it pretty easy to rent a car. Sometimes you can get one for very cheap, but it's not quite the ideal experience if you're looking for a particular car. Companies like Hertz had big plans for EVs and Teslas in particular. In fact, they bought about 100,000 Teslas and expanded from there, but their timing ended up being very rough, buying these Teslas when they were at a high price overall and in very high demand. In time, they experienced a lot of depreciation and ended up unloading a lot of these EVs. So it ended up not entirely working too well for this big company, and oftentimes renting an electric car from one of these companies doesn't end up being the ideal experience. Of course, nowadays, though, we live in this app-based world. We have things like Uber for taxis or Lyft. We have Airbnb instead of staying at a hotel. Now, some of these things are shifting around to where the previous version seems a little better, but still they can offer a great experience that is convenient for the customer. And it can be a business opportunity on the other side of that. In comes Turo. This is the Airbnb of rental cars. Turo has really taken off over the last few years, and for many it's a great experience thanks to the extras you can get from hosts. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows, especially as a host of a car. Today I'm breaking down my experience as a Turo host, why I gave up, why I started again, and some of the biggest horror stories from my experience, so let's get into it. And a special thanks to Aviron for sponsoring this video. As I was mentioning, the Turo experience can be very good for customers. You can choose things like airport pickups for your car, get extra bonuses, flexibility, and of course, rent the car that you want to rent. You can look on the Turo app and find the exact car you want in the exact location and choose a bunch of great options. I've used Turo myself many times to rent a Tesla specifically, and it's a very seamless experience, especially if you get a good host. Initially in 2020, though, this was a great opportunity for me as a host on Turo, because the Model Y was brand new. At that time, this was a very exciting car that the world had not seen yet from Tesla, and really interest back then was extremely high in this car, so much so that it escalated to become the world's best-selling car within a couple years. Now, I got my Model Y back in March of 2020, and then Tesla's factory shut down. So I was within the first 2,100 people to get this car delivered, and people were very excited to try out this car. So it rented very well on Turo once I put it up, and it did so at a decent price for quite some time. It worked out well pairing that with this channel where I talked about this car a lot, and it was during a time when I was obviously home a lot and not really needing to drive all that much. But of course, then came my first accident with my beautiful new Model Y. This was the first accident that happened on this car, and it happened via the renter that was not at fault. They got rear-ended, and it was the other person's fault. It ended up being about $11,000 in repairs, but of course it was all handled through insurance. In this particular case, I actually went through the at-fault driver's insurance, since that's what Tesla wants you to do. So I didn't have to pay a cent here because I was not at fault and neither was my renter. But of course it was a huge hassle, and my car was basically out of commission for 3 weeks. I learned a lot about navigating insurance and what you really have to push for there. I learned about diminished value claims because this car was off the Turo platform for 3 whole weeks and not earning money as a result of this accident. And then I of course learned that this passive business really isn't that passive, since I was actively dealing with this issue. Overall with the Model Y though, I did have about 26 trips on Turo, and the majority of them were great. Renters were excited to try this car, and they returned it in decent condition, or great condition. But then a second accident happened for that car in Pasadena. I personally got rear-ended on the way to a gig in the carpool lane, and it was a whole ordeal. And this one actually ended up being about a $23,000 repair. Again though, that one was covered by the at-fault driver's insurance, but it was me driving the car. So at that point, after dealing with that, but still wanting to expand a little bit, I decided to get my dad involved in this business to help me out a little bit. Shortly after this, a renter took this car up to San Francisco, and there was a major axle failure that led to about a $6,000 repair. This was likely actually caused by a previous renter, but everyone that investigated couldn't actually tell what truly happened here. But it ended up being a very big deal. That was of course very frustrating, and then the car had to be repaired by Tesla up in San Francisco, and I'm in Los Angeles, so then we had to retrieve the car and drive it all the way down after. That ended up being quite the ordeal as well, and we had to deal with all the other costs associated with that, but I still stuck with it because I know a lot of people that succeed here. My business expanded with a 2021 Plaid Model S, and I ended up having 44 trips in total. There was overall solid profitability there, but of course, consistent curb rash and then minor bumper and underbody damage specifically to this Plaid Model S. That's definitely tough to stomach on a car like the Plaid Model S, but you really just have to fully accept this stuff if you're going to rent your car out on Turo. Curb rash is just a full reality. Basically, just expect if you're going to have this car on Turo for some time, all 4 of your rims are going to be completely shot at the end of this experience. You have to fully accept this and then just document it each time it occurs. Next up today, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Aviron. Aviron is changing the way people think about fitness. You might know them for their award-winning rower, but they've expanded, now offering a gamified bike and the world's first gamified treadmill. What makes Aviron different is how they blend gameplay and exercise. You can run through immersive worlds, compete in interactive games, take scenic rides, take coached classes, or stream your favorite shows, all from a 22-inch touchscreen. With thousands of workouts and fresh content added monthly, boredom doesn't stand a chance, and they have great community features with leaderboards, as well as the ability to race against friends. The treadmill itself is designed for comfort and accessibility, with an impact-absorbing CloudStrike deck for a smooth stride and ultra-low 4-inch deck for added stability. Whether you're just getting started or training hard, it's built to support every fitness level. It's also one of the quietest treadmills I've ever used personally, to the point where I can watch things on it without headphones. Aviron's goal is simple: end boring workouts and help people build habits that last by making fitness something you actually look forward to. And they're doing that with this treadmill, a bike, and 2 different rowers. To check out Aviron for yourself, click the link in the description below and use code RyanShaw50 for $50 off all of their products. But by this point, I had sold that 2020 Model Y. I was driving a 2022 Model Y myself, and then I added 2 cars to my fleet. So I had 3 cars on Turo, that 2021 Plaid Model S, and then I added a used 2018 Model 3 mid-range and a 2021 Model 3 standard range to that fleet. So again, at my peak, I had 3 Teslas listed, and I hosted a total of 86 trips there. I was dealing with a lot, but then so was my dad, with charging logistics, juggling my personal driveway space, always having to juggle these cars around, and then quick turnarounds. So for me, it really became a common stressor, because no matter how much I had someone else helping with stuff, I really, at the end of the day, had to deal with these problems. And this is the reality of running a Turo fleet. You'll be cleaning a lot. It's essential and very time consuming, so I was personally trying to outsource to hand washes, but those of course add up in cost. And then sometimes you wash the car, but then renters cancel last minute, because they can do so up to 24 hours in advance, which definitely can disrupt my planning. If I had been planning to shift my cars around and wash them at certain times, and then the renter cancels, it definitely can be frustrating, especially when I'm then parked outside and the car's just going to get dirty again. Then one thing we had added to attract renters was unlimited miles and free supercharging, but this often led to excessive long-distance trips. So I had a few major incidents there. The first one that really took it over the edge for me was that one renter took my Model 3 on a 2,000-mile road trip. They said once they got there that they had tire damage and that it was there when they had picked up the car. Of course, that was not true, but that was basically their excuse to not get it fixed. They would not get this tire fixed because, well, it wasn't my fault. We told them all of the steps that they can take and that we would pay for a new tire and everything involved, but ultimately we had to get Turo involved to even get air into this tire and then get it patched. And then they drove it all the way back and dropped it off, and of course, when the car arrived, it was filthy and then damaged as well. The other big one after this was that another driver driving the Plaid was driving about 145 miles per hour, which violates Turo's policy, and then forced us to use speed limit mode. Now, of course, we're not checking in on Turo renters all the time, but I did happen to open the app, it opened to that car, and then I saw 145 miles per hour on a normal road. That's definitely a pretty big deal. And then I had one other renter that gave me a 1-star review because at the last minute, they told me that I was supposed to pick them up at the airport in this car. That is definitely not something we personally offered on this car, but they assumed it was, so Turo actually later removed this review for us after looking through the chat and seeing the justification. So at that time in 2022, I had made about $28,509 in overall revenue, mostly from the Plaid, but a lot of that went to the car payments, insurance, maintenance, and labor. And then of course for me, this just grew to be high stress, low profit, and I saw a lot of vehicle depreciation and more, so it stacked up and I decided to entirely give up. It took me a little bit of time, but I sold all 3 of these cars, and then I was just back to my personal vehicles. However, that was then. I have a very good friend who operates his own Turo fleet, and after about 2 to 3 years of talking to him about his experience there, I decided to actually partner with him. He offered to take one vehicle off my hands just to give it a try and see how it went. See, he's not only incredibly efficient at the whole Turo experience and doing a lot of the steps himself, including washing the cars, but he actually enjoys the experience and the problem solving overall. Basically, he's a total pro as a Turo host. So we partnered, and the first car that I put up was my 2022 Model Y. The great thing for me is that he really is handling all of the problems. I hear from him when necessary, especially when there's a necessary repair. But overall, he's chatting with renters and handling all of the day-to-day operations. So that car has done very well, but has already seen its fair share of repairs. They're usually minor, but necessary to get repaired. Here's one on the rear bumper that just happened recently. It's a definite obvious scrape here, and this actually is something that some people maybe wouldn't repair, but we always try to keep them in top shape, and it's always best to solve it right away with the renter, or through Turo insurance if that's the route you're going. You have to decide, are you going through the renter directly? Is insurance through Turo the best option given your deductible cost, and more. Another thing we had recently was a full windshield replacement. Here's the before, where it obviously got hit by a rock or something quite large. It was very much a crack on the windshield that required a full replacement, and then here it is after. It happens, but again, my friend is incredibly good at getting these repairs done quickly, and to not need to cancel any rentals as a result. That's one thing you really have to think about. If your car gets into an accident and you have a rental scheduled 2 days from then, it's very unfortunate because then you're losing out on that money, and you have to cancel that rental as a result. If it got into an accident, they're not going to leave you a bad review or anything, and Turo's not going to dock you, but in general, you don't want to have to cancel a rental, especially if that rental was going to be especially long. We've definitely had that before where we got this repair done incredibly quickly so that we could keep that 1 month rental or whatever. But then in early 2024, I bought a standard range refreshed Model 3. It was a great car for me and for the channel, but I ended up deciding to put this one on Turo, and for myself, I switched to a performance Model 3. It made sense again overall to expand to a second car, and I wanted the performance Model 3 for myself. But within a few weeks, of course, we had damage. This one was actually pretty rough to the front bumper and the driver's side wheel, as you can see in these photos. And then, of course, as expected sometimes, this renter just blamed it on full self-driving and tried to take no responsibility whatsoever. Essentially, he was trying to tell us that we knew the car would malfunction, we know how FSD works, and that it malfunctions, so it's our fault because we rented him the car that malfunctions in this way. Of course, that is not the rationale here, but it doesn't really matter because we went through Turo and Turo Insurance and got this thing repaired. Now keep in mind, these are all the horror stories I'm getting into, both before this and after this. And in between all of these are plenty of entirely normal rides. There are plenty of rides where the renter is extremely nice, leaves the car in great shape, and can't wait to rent from us again. Then there are plenty of rides where everything was easy for us, and they were just happy. But then inevitably, after a long stretch of good situations, you are just waiting and know that something is going to happen. And this next renter was quite the situation. First off, the Model 3 was returned with no word, and something just felt off about it. You would open the driver's side door, but it actually wouldn't open properly, and you really had to yank with some force to even get into the car. Obviously something was wrong there, but at first glance you couldn't really tell. As it turns out, and we learned in some time, this car had actually been into an accident, but the renter tried to quietly replace just the driver's side window on their own. It was a very cheap, poorly installed part, and clearly more had been damaged, but you couldn't actually fully see it. They actually accidentally left a receipt for that repair in the car as well, so that definitely tipped us off. Then the interior itself reeked from being smoked in, and the car inside was just completely trashed. It took a lot to clean this back up, and then of course we had to pay specifically to get the smoke smell out of it. This renter did not respond to anything we said, so we of course filed a claim through Tesla's insurance. After a lot of back and forth with Turo and $750 out of pocket for our protection plan through Turo, the final repair was about $14,000. So this was quite the repair that this car had to have that the renter did not even mention. And of course it was covered by insurance, so no real worry there. But then after we got this repair, there was even more. I received a parking ticket from the city of Culver City in the mail, which I had to put into his name and then deal with forwarding it over there. And then I got a red light camera ticket for this car as well. I really wish I could show you the photo that was included there or the video, because he was having a blast running that particular light. Here, I'll just do my impression of his face caught by this red light camera. So again, he ended up saying nothing and was very irresponsible, and we had a lot to deal with there. But ultimately, he ended up paying for all of it. He had to, of course, eventually pay for these tickets and the damage through his Turo insurance and more. So those are, of course, just my cars, but my friend also gets damage to his cars as well. For instance, here's another situation that he had that was pretty wild. A trip with his Model 3 ended, and the renter simply didn't return the car. It was radio silence, they didn't reply to any messages, or tell him where the car actually was. Ultimately, he could see where the car was from the Tesla app, but Turo support told him not to go and retrieve it because they didn't really know what was going on. So instead, he had to get the police involved here. After 2 full days of just not knowing why the car was where it was, or really where it was, it suddenly appeared at the drop-off location with no word. Apparently this renter tried to say something like they didn't know how the app worked, but overall there was no explanation and nothing, and it was just a missing car. It's pretty wild, and it makes you really appreciate the Tesla app and that you can track these cars at all times. He also had another renter with a Model 3, and this one returned our Model 3 with a completely shattered rear window. And again, they didn't say a single word about it. They drove around seemingly for a lot of the trip with that broken window, and then just tried to drop it off with no word. The cost to repair this window was actually cheaper than the $750 Turo insurance deductible, so we opted to fix it ourselves without filing a claim for this particular instance. And that is something you have to consider. Each time that this happens, it is $750 or whatever your particular protection plan is. So maybe you want to go for a plan that has less of a deductible if you're dealing with this kind of thing all of the time. But of course, that cuts into your earnings because they charge you more for that. But again, it's really easy to focus in on all of these issues, and even with all of these stories, they really do end up being the exception. And they seem to be the thing that separates people willing to make this work into those who are not willing to make it work. Obviously before, I couldn't do it myself, but now with my friend, I actually am willing to take this on. So about a month ago, I decided to switch my personal car to the new Model Y. Again, it's one of those things that makes overall sense for me personally and this channel. And if you want to see my full explanation there, you can check out that video linked up here or in the description below. But I got that car and then put my performance Model 3 on Turo. One weekend, the renter got a flat tire. And this is the new performance Model 3, so that's of course a brand new performance tire, and it needs to match the other tires on this car straight from the factory, so this ended up being about $520. We had to get this entirely replaced, and this was not something that they said could be repaired. Luckily, there was no issue with the renter here. They were great about it and took it straight to the shop, and then we just reimbursed them for getting that repaired. But of course, it's a big thing to deal with. So right now, we're deciding on potentially replacing the wheels for this car and finding ones that can still function, but support far cheaper tires that last longer, like 18s. Those are much more suitable for Turo. Otherwise, we're going to be seeing more and more flats because these low-profile tires can face flats more often, and then when they're specific performance tires, they just don't last as long. Unplugged Performance actually has these new wheels designed specifically for this purpose. They say, the world's first indestructible wheel, lifetime warranty backed, break it and it's replaced for free. And their video of this is pretty wild, the tests that they're putting this through. This is not an ad in any way, but they do seem to be a very smart solution for people operating Turo fleets. If you curb these wheels like they're showing here, the rim protector is ultimately what gets curbed, and then it's fully removable. That's just something I'm going to be looking into and could be something for you as a Turo host. But first, let's go over some reasons you might want to avoid being a Turo host. First, if this kind of thing and this video stresses you out and you are just hoping to avoid things like this, maybe you're expecting that you can join Turo and no, that stuff isn't going to happen to me, definitely don't do it. Damage is inevitable here. You will have to deal with things like this. Maybe you won't have as crazy of situations like I've talked about, but you will have stuff like this. Then, if you're particularly precious about your car, this is not something to go for. Ultimately, this car becomes an insurance-covered repairable asset that you are renting out to people. So I typically would not recommend this if it's your personal car and it's a car that you care about. If it's your personal car that you actually need to rely upon, there's a good chance it will get in an accident while out on a trip, and then you'll be out your personal car while awaiting repairs, and you also won't be able to rent it at the same time. Then another thing is if you're trying to outsource too much of this process and you don't have a partner in this, it's probably not going to work out. Things like car washes add up in particular, and I experienced this. So either you should be good at them yourself and somewhat actually enjoy doing them, since you'll be doing them all the time, or you should have a reasonable way to get them done that doesn't cut too much into your bottom line. Then, if you're hoping that this is a good way to cover the cost of that dream car, again, it's the same kind of thing here. It can, in theory, help, but you're wearing on the car for sure and putting it to a lot of risk. Ultimately, interest in cars on Turo ends up dying down, no matter how great it is at a certain time. Take the Tesla Cybertruck, for example. That's probably one of the biggest examples here. When that car was first available on Turo, it was about $1,000 a day or so, and people would pay that amount. So immediately, that seems like an incredible investment as a Turo host. Buy a car that at the time was $100,000 or $120,000, but then you're renting it out for $1,000 a day. Pretty soon you're going to be able to turn a profit, and that's going to be amazing. But fast forward to today, and Tesla has greatly slowed production of this car, and only sold about 4,300 of them last quarter entirely. At this point, the Cybertruck is readily available with plenty of incentives from Tesla, so the interest never really lasts at that high level. And there are tons of Cybertrucks on Turo at this point. So it seems like there were probably a lot of people that were hoping to bank on this, and then all of a sudden interest was down on the Cybertruck, and then there were a ton competing on the same platform. I experienced that same thing on Turo with the Model Y. I was one of the first to have that on Turo, but then of course, tons of people added their Model Ys to the platform, and now it's very readily available there. And then I also experienced this with the Plaid Model S. So ultimately, interest in these cool cars will die down in time. But some cars do remain, and it's very interesting to see actually how Turo doesn't really distinguish all that well between long-range and standard-range cars. That's because when you look at gas vehicles, you're really just renting the gas version of this car. And it will note the different trims, but they're not really too concerned with range. Ultimately, renting a standard range car on Turo can actually do quite well and be the best bang for your buck as a host, because people don't really know the difference when they're renting it, and it still can be a really great experience for them, especially if you're renting a Tesla and using the supercharger network. And at least right now from Tesla, these cars tend to come with all the same premium features. Now, here are some reasons that you might want to do this as a host. If you like problem solving and potentially are passionate about sharing these cars with people, it could be a good opportunity for you. Then if you're a people person and you're happy to message with renters and help introduce them to the car, help them solve simple problems and more, this is probably for you. And then if you want to have an extra car or are really wanting to build a fleet of cars for other reasons, this could be a good opportunity as well. I know some Turo renters are kind of building up their fleet with the long hope that Tesla's robotaxi comes to be, and then they can basically transfer from being a Turo fleet to being a robotaxi fleet. I'm not really hanging my hat on that because it still seems a long ways off, and then it also seems like doing it with personal cars may be quite a stretch, at least anytime in the relative near future when these cars are still in good condition. But for some people, they do have that in mind. For myself, it mostly makes sense so that I can follow up on these how's it holding up type honest reviews of how these cars are doing over time. I'm racking up mileage on a 2022 Model Y and a 2024 Model 3, so I'll be able to report on how things are going there. And one of those cars also has white interior, so I can see how those white seats hold up in time, getting probably the most abuse it would get. So of course it takes work to be a host on Turo, but we did just become a Turo All-Star host. Here's some of that criteria. They say your account must be open and free of active policy violations. You have to have 20 or more completed trips across all listings, including deleted listings, or 80 trip days across 5 trips. You have to have a 5-star rating for about 85% for all completed trips, including unrated trips. Your maintenance rate needs to be at or above 80% for all completed trips, including unrated trips. And then your cleanliness rate has to be above 80% for all completed trips, including unrated trips. Then kind of the big one here, your personal cancellation rate has to be less than 3% for all of your trips. That's a pretty big one there because as a Turo host, you're not supposed to cancel on anybody, even though the guest is able to cancel in as little as 24 hours notice. So here's some general advice if you're looking to do the Turo thing. First off, take 1,000,000 photos every single time you are checking this car in or checking it out. Ultimately, that's your evidence that no, that tire wasn't actually deflated when you picked it up. Because look, here's the photo of it in the pickup spot. And then your photos after the fact will act in the same manner. Then trust your gut and don't try to be nice here. You can be accommodating, but in one case we decided to try out being nice to a renter and letting them pay for a repair later since their money was particularly tight at the time. We knew the risk here, and then ultimately this renter didn't pay for it. They blamed FSD for the damage, as I mentioned earlier, and then ghosted us entirely after that. So we had to cover that cost, and that's one of those never again situations. So you have to be very clear here. Turo has requirements and procedures for a reason, and no matter how nice anybody is, they must be followed. One particular story with previous cars for me that was fascinating actually involved an insurance fraud case. Everything seemed particularly normal at the beginning of this rental, and my renter took the car from my street as expected. Then the next day they informed me that their personal car, which they said they had parked on my street, was stolen. This already seemed quite unlikely for my area, and then I ended up hearing from the police on this. They were actually investigating her because the car had ended up on fire about 60 miles away from me. The renter was doing an insurance claim for this car, but then there was an insurance fraud investigation as a result. And looking through the previously visited locations in the maps on screen in the Tesla, which they didn't erase, they had driven to about the exact location where this fire occurred. So I gave that info to investigators, and I don't know what happened from there. But basically everything seemed fine, and then it ended up being part of an investigation. So ultimately, you can be kind, but you really can't totally trust anybody. This could be the best renter in the world, or they could damage the car and act like nothing happened, like has happened multiple times to us. Turo has procedures for that, and they ultimately will help you. With all of this said, I now have 3 cars on Turo. One is a Model Y, and then there are 2 Model 3s. My friend is ultimately running the thing and doing a great job, and then I check in periodically and then help to solve the bigger issues. However, very soon, as always, I'm expecting a new repair to pop up. And that's why I'm currently assessing Turo's insurance plans. The breakdown here as a host is that Turo has 5 different plans. First is the 60 plan. This is a $0 deductible in exchange for a lower percentage of earnings. You earn 60% of the trip price, and then Turo pays 100% of eligible damage costs, and you have no deductible. Up from there is the 75 plan, which they say is enjoy higher earnings with a minimal deductible. That deductible is $250, and then you get 75% of that trip price. And then there's the 80 plan, which is what my cars are currently on. They say pocket more with a moderate deductible. This is a $750 deductible, and then you earn 80% of the trip price. Up from there, they have the 85 plan, which they say is earn big by taking on a larger deductible, and that deductible is $1,625. And then lastly, there's the 90 plan. Cash in on the highest risk, highest earning plan. You get 90% of the trip price, but it's a $2,500 deductible if anything goes wrong. I think the current plan I'm on has made the most sense overall, but I will be doing the math here because if we keep having these repairs that do need to go through insurance, it's $750 each time. So you have to, of course, weigh that against the reduction in earnings that you get by going with a lower deductible. Ultimately, you do want to and do have to use Turo's insurance plans here. And at the end of the day, that is kind of what Turo is. They're a rental service, but they're really selling insurance both to renters and the people renting their cars. So that's the latest on my Turo experience and a collection of all of the horror stories that I have dealt with so far. Some of them have been pretty crazy, but thanks to the help of my friend, they've all been sorted out pretty quickly without too much hassle. Ultimately, some people will watch a video like this and say, why would anyone want to rent out their car on Turo? But others will say, oh, I've hosted 500 trips and I've had none of these issues, or I've had tons of these issues, but it's always worth it. It's really interesting to see that people are passionate about this, and some people would never touch it with a 10-foot pole. In any case, I'll be sure to keep you posted on how it goes into the near future, and I'm particularly curious to see what happens with this Performance Model 3. In the meantime, if you want to see a full video breaking down why I decided to switch to the Model Y over that Performance Model 3, you can check that out linked up here or in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.